Hello everyone, welcome back to our Silmarillion Bible studies. Today we're going to be discussing the biblical parallels and narratives that we find in the event known as the Cuivienen. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. My Quenya is a little rusty, but for those of you who are diehard Tolkien fans, I welcome you to join us as we take the time to give ourselves another reason to appreciate these things. Once again, my assertion in these studies is not to make an authoritative claim and say this is what Tolkien had in mind when laying these stories down. But on the other hand, the point of this ministry is to make the claim and confirm it with evidence that nothing is secular if we're willing to take it through the narrative and lens of God's Word. And if you are a Christian and are familiar with Tolkien's work, I welcome you to spend some time in God's Word with me, as well as gain a new appreciation perhaps for Tolkien's work in general. If you are not a Christian but a fan of Tolkien's work, I invite and welcome you to join us in today's study as we discuss the biblical narrative so you can see things not only from this perspective, but also get the chance to get some clarity on the parallels of the Bible that we find therein. And lastly, most importantly, if you're just a fan of God's Word and want some time to spend in it, I welcome you here as well. The event of the Cuivienen, it's a very interesting event in that it was the time where life first entered into Middle-earth. Now, note, there were events where living things certainly had been introduced to Middle-earth beyond that of the Valar and the Maya and so forth. But with all these things being made in regard, and again, the event with the dwarves, which we'll talk about next week, and all of these other different things that were going on in Tolkien's work, this one was very interesting to me. Because in the time that was taken to study this, it brought me back, and hopefully will bring all of us back as well, to the time of Israel before it became a nation. As these things were being introduced, much like the firstborn of the Elves, we're going to see how the people of Israel and their introduction to the Promised Land parallels very well with how the three original groups of elves and their fathers, to which were named in Quenya, 1, 2, and 3 accordingly, and how they responded to their opportunity to have a living and practical relationship with their Creator. So, if you'd like to join me on that journey, I welcome you to turn in your Bibles to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verses 19 through 20, where we're going to be reading this parallel demonstrated and illustrated through this passage. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey his voice, and that you may cling to him, for he is your life, and the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. Now, a little bit of historical context for this passage before we get into the parallels here. Moses, at the time of writing this passage, is 120 years old and is about to die. God promised, essentially, the land known as Canaan, modern-day Israel, to the people of Israel, and this promise is about to be fulfilled. And the book of Deuteronomy itself is Moses' last sermons before he goes on to his reward and the people move on into their next stage in their relationship with God. And this series of last sermons before passing the mantle of leadership on to Joshua, which is the next book regarding the biblical canon, gives us an insight into not only the options they had ahead of themselves, but ultimately where that future would lead them. And there was quite a lot of things ahead for Israel in their near future. Because, as was stated before, the Promised Land was called as such because God made a promise that they would have this land. But it wasn't unoccupied territory. For the last 440 years leading up to this point, Canaan was, for all intents and purposes, quite obviously inhabited by people known as the Canaanites. And these people, through the witness of Abraham, had had a living relationship with God. They had gotten a witness of the truth. Abraham even met people who knew of God before him, Melchizedek in Jerusalem, as well as in several other places. And the entire nation had the experience of knowing their options as far as which God they could choose and worship and serve. And naturally, over time, the way of human beings is following the second law of thermodynamics. We're all breaking down. And they had chosen to worship other gods through some rather vulgar means. This involved not only ritualistic abortions, but sexual immorality in ways that would make the United States cringe today. And on top of that, just a lifestyle and culture that centered itself around violence. So after 440 years of God giving these people second chances after second chances, and go exponentially over to that point as to how many chances these people have been given, God made a prophecy in saying, until they are going to be held accountable for their sins, you're not going to live in that land. And in fact, in Genesis chapter 15, when God made this promise to Abraham, he said, you're going to live here. I've promised this land to you, but you're not going to live in it until the people who currently are living in it have exhausted every single last chance I'm going to give them. This is Genesis 15, verse 13. Then he said to Abram, know certainly your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. So where Abraham's descendants are living are not only going to treat Israel harshly during that time, but they're going to end up being judged for it. Afterwards, they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. This won't be in your lifetime. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation, they shall return here, where God's speaking to Abram in Canaan. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, the Amorites were one of the many people groups that would ultimately make up the Canaanite people. And as well, later on in the chapter, he goes and lists them off for us. The Canaanites, the Jebusites, Perizzites, Amorites, Hivites, Hittites, Amalekites, all of those different people that are more impronounceable than Quenya. So when you're getting down to it, ultimately, God made under no specific terms, only at this time are you to displace these people from this country. You'd go in and conquer the promised land. And we'd also need to have to understand this wasn't until they had had literally every single possible conceivable chance to turn around. And every reason to as well. Because when God judged that nation, it was because they knew better. God didn't say, judge all the nations for doing things that I don't like, because they didn't know any better. The Amorites, however, did, and that's why, just like with Noah's flood in the past, and as well with Sodom and Gomorrah, a few years prior to Abram's interaction with God here, we see that God using people as an instrument of God's judgment isn't all that unfounded, nor was it all that unfair, because 440 years is a lot of second chances to make, especially considering what was going on in that country at the time that God was putting up with. And as well, when God eventually called Israel to go to war with these people, it was only to go to war with those that God has marked for judgment. And you wonder, well, doesn't that make Christianity a violent religion? It would be if God didn't actually fulfill his promise through the nation of Israel. Because you don't hear about Amorites today, or Hivites, or Hittites, or Perizzites, or Jebusites, or Canaanites, or Amalekites, or Philistines. All these people were wiped out. So obviously it worked when God judged them for their sins. No, some took longer than others. The Philistines weren't wiped out till Nebuchadnezzar came in. And Nebuchadnezzar was actually used by we'll talk about those things at a later date. But you understand the pattern and code of conduct that's being demonstrated here. We're not called to conquer anyone in the name of God, because everyone who was conquered in the name of God had every reason and excuse not to do the things that earned them judgment. And in the same way, those who had earned judgment were given a lot of second chances and were doing a lot of really gnarly things. Slow to anger, but sure in judgment. That's the God that we serve. But understanding as well, when this promise was made leading up to their future, you're going to live in the promised land, and you have a choice to follow God and receive it, or reject God and ultimately lose anything that you would ever have had. That's what we read in Deuteronomy. But going well in that promise, God made the prediction to Abram, later named Abraham, before he even had his first son, that you are going to not only have more descendants than stars, enough to fill up this whole country, but on top of that, in a very interesting way, they're going to live in a separate country before this, and for 400 years. Now, if you're wondering where the extra 40 years came from, how long did it take them to make their journey to the promised land? The 40-year wanderings in the wilderness. More on this in a second. But understand, their past is also significant leading up to where they're going in the future, because when the Israelites are stated in this prophecy as being strangers in the land for 400 years, this is God alluding to Egypt. And as well going into details about the number of generations before they would actually start becoming oppressed in this nation. 4 generations. We have Abraham, we have Isaac, we have Jacob, and in the generation of Joseph, that was the time when Israel lived peaceably in the promised land, or rather in the land of Egypt. In the land in which they would be strangers, they were just saying, we're just kind of here to wait out the famine. And since Joseph is your head of state, Genesis chapters 42 through 50, that is when Israel was living it well. But then at the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, it said there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And that's when they began to be enslaved and oppressed. And 400 years passed before Moses was raised up. And that's the interesting thing about all of this, is that once the Amorites had passed and ignored every single chance God gave them, that's when judgment fell. But then even then he gave them further chances, because when Israel wouldn't trust God to take over the promised land, to fight these battles for them, to face the giants they knew that they couldn't fight, God said, all right, well, we're going to take our time through the wilderness then until you're ready to trust me. And this is what we're talking about here today concerning the Cuivienen, because when you understand, while they were in their time in Egypt and when they left the nation of Egypt to the promised land, it wasn't, as the crow flies, an 11-day journey, as it would be geographically to us today. The nation of Israel took 40 years of their wanderings in the wilderness, and of all the people groups that left the nation of Egypt to return to the promised land, to receive these promises of God that they had never seen in their lifetimes, the nation of Israel was about to be born. They were about to be given a nation, given borders, given a flag. And with all of these things also came the responsibility of listening to the one who would lead them there, who would be their king there, their center of worship there, their God there, who would be the one to keep them from making the same mistakes that those before them had. And for all intents and purposes, the people who were leaving the land of Egypt could be divided up into 3 categories. And for all intents and purposes that totally will not come into play in our illustration to this in the Silmarillion later, we'll refer to them as the fair Jews, the deep Jews, and the lost Jews. All those in the nation of Israel that were entering into the promised land, there were 3 types of individuals. The first were the fair Jews. The fair Jews were the Israelites, who for all intents and purposes, to associate with this parallel, and to give us an idea of what was going on historically, were the Israelites who obeyed God, believed his promises, and ultimately followed him into the promised land. These blessings were promised to them, and likewise, warnings were also given to them in the book of Leviticus, chapter 26. I'm going to start in verse 3. If you walk in my statutes, God speaking, and keep my commandments and perform them, then I will give you rain in its season, the land shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall last till the time of vintage, and the vintage shall last till the time of sowing. You shall eat your bread to the full, and dwell in your land safely. I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none will make you afraid. I will rid the land of evil beasts, and the sword will not go through your land. You will chase your enemies, and they shall fall by the sword before you. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. Sounds like the Noldor. Your enemies shall fall by the sword before you, for I will look on you favorably, and make you fruitful, multiply you, and confirm my covenant with you. You shall eat the old harvest, and clear out the old, because of the new. You'll have so much that literally you'll have leftovers in the coming year. I will set my tabernacle among you. Now there's the big one. My soul shall not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. I have broken the bands of your yoke and made you walk upright. But if you do not obey me, you do not observe all these commandments, if you despise my statutes, or if your soul abhors my judgments so that you do not perform all my commandments, but break my covenant, I also will do this to you. I will even appoint terror over you. Fear will be introduced. Anyone catching something here? wasting disease and fever which shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart. You shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you, and you shall be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will reign over you, and you shall flee when no one pursues you. Now this was the summary of everything that not only those Jews that would trust in God would receive, but also the curses of those who rejected God would receive. God's fair enough in summarizing these things, and the passage goes even further into details about all of this in literally a prophetic sense of predicting everything that Israel would end up doing when they ultimately rejected and stopped trusting in God. But again, we're talking about the Jews when they were first entering into the Promised Land, so those will be discussed at a later date. But just like we talked about the fair Jews, the Jews that accepted and received and followed God's promises, entered into the Promised Land, there were also the deep Jews. And these were expressly demonstrated to us through not all the tribes of Israel, but 2.5 in particular. And I mean a half in a very unique set of circumstances. The tribes of Reuben, of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, because they were a very populous tribe, ended up coming to the border of the Promised Land and liked the green valleys that they saw there. Unfortunately, because of the fact that they hadn't seen the Promised Land yet, they kind of looked around and said, I'm pretty comfortable with what I see here. I like the forests. I like the green that I have access to right now. I mean, yeah, Valinor is going to be great. I've heard all your stories and stuff, but can we kind of just settle down here? And there was a real big issue about all of this because Gad was not only, his name means troop, that's where Israel's military basically came from, but on top of that, Reuben and half the tribe of Manasseh, that'd be a serious blow to Israel's numbers. They'd need that military strength if they were going to go in and conquer the Promised Land. So Moses is like, guys, what are you doing? We're right here at the edge of the Promised Land. We've just gotten here. And you're already backing out on this deal? And they said, oh, no. We'll go in. This is Numbers 32, verse 31. The children of Gad and the children of Reuben answered and said, as the Lord said to your servants, so we shall do. We will cross over armed before the Lord to the land of Canaan. But the possession of our inheritance shall remain with us on this side of the Jordan River, what basically made the barrier, the border of the Promised Land. So, for all intents and purposes, understand what's going on here. The deep Jews were the kind of Jews that trusted God, but only up to a certain point. They settled for less than the completion of what God promised them. They saw what they had good in the world, and they said, I kind of like the wilderness. We'll still go and fight the enemies of God, but when it comes down to it, can we stay here, even though they hadn't even seen what God had in store for them yet? Unfortunately, they settled for less, but it didn't make them rebels against God in any way. It did, however, give them kind of a closer than comfort proximity to the enemies of God, and when Israel eventually did end up rebelling against God, they were actually the first ones to be taken out. Note the parallels there as well. But I mentioned 3, the fair Jews, the deep Jews, but also the third category, and sadly the most unfortunate, were what we are going to call the lost Jews. 40 years in the wilderness is a long time. And in these wanderings, the reason why they kept going in circles in the Sinai Peninsula was because of a lack of trust in God. Obviously, you're not going to go into battle, or you're not ready to go into battle if you don't trust the one who's going to give you victory. So instead of God just pushing them in and saying, you're going to go to heaven and you're going to like it, you're going to receive my promises, you take this blessing and you're going to eat it, mister. No, God said, all right, you're not ready for it, I'll wait. In fact, we'll all wait. And during this time period, during the occurrences in which, in the book of Numbers, recorded for us throughout, in what is called through many rabbinical commentators, it's the book of grumblings, because that's what was essentially happening throughout the entire book of Numbers. The people were walking through the wilderness. You're like, God, why don't you give us some food? It's like, I've been giving you guys healthy donuts raining from the sky every morning. What do you want? He's like, can we have some quail? Because this manna is just getting boring. And God's like, oh, boy, You guys don't understand. I'm here to meet your needs, not your greeds. If I give you guys more than enough dough to make you guys happy, then you'll just get tired of it. If I give you guys meat, you'll get tired of that too. And guess what? They did. So all these things end up happening over and over again. They said, God, you're leading us into the wilderness to kill us. We're going to go back to Egypt, and they ended up being struck dead. There was people who rose up in rebellion against Moses and said, you just brought us out here to... This is basically the most common objection they had to him. You just brought us out here to kill us. And God said, all right, you want to see who I've elected leadership? Then you guys bring out your sticks, and we're going to see which one comes back to life again. And the rest of you, I mean, you can go home right now, or you can test God. The rest of you who are lying in my name will be put to death. Do you want to play this game? And they did. In fact, more than 200 people tried to say, oh, I want to be leader of Israel, not taking seriously the fact that God they were dealing with, and they ended up getting killed. And all of these things continued in this cycle until eventually there was this point where people just ended up dying in the wilderness as the result of all of this, and they never got to see God's promises fulfilled for their lives. They ended up missing out on everything they could have had because of greed, because of fear, or just because of out of bad habit. And this is summarized for us in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 6. Now these things became our examples, Paul speaking, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted, and do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, he quotes Numbers, or Exodus actually, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. If you want to know what that's referring to, it's the golden calf incident in Exodus, but the word being used there referring to play is what's generally associated with these riotous parties in pagan rituals, which involved very little clothing. I'll let the rest up to your imagination. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Yikes, that's a lot. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. That's, of course, referring to the bronze serpent incident. That's where we get our hospital symbol today. Nor complain, as some of them also complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, whom upon the ends of the ages have come. So we read about all these things in the Old Testament and say, so what? We say, well, you're in a relationship with God, aren't you? You're learning to trust God every day. You go back on your promises, you're only bringing death on yourself. Not because God's just like so offended that he's just going to strike you dead. Separation from God and his goodness is the literal definition of evil and death. So understand that point in principle. We've discussed this with our studies on Morgoth and Sauron as well. But going into all of these points, to recap all of these things, the Jews that didn't trust God, the lost Jews, who died never having or known or seen God's promises. The Jews that only trusted God so far and didn't know what they were missing out on were the first to be taken over by God's enemies, and as well, when the nation began to reject God, didn't know what they were missing out on. They settled for less than what God wanted for them. And then lastly, the Jews that did trust God not only got to see the promised land, but lived in it quite comfortably. As long as they trusted God to bless and protect them, of course. More on Fëanor and the illustrations found there later. Now, with all these things in mind, did you catch the parallels? The three groups of elves that awoke at the Cuivienen were the Minyar, the Tatyar, pardon my Quenya, and the Nelyar. 1, 2, and 3, those groups. The fair elves that trusted Orome, their creator, at his word and saw the Undying Lands to live in peace there forever. The deep elves rather, who trusted and followed Orome to a certain point, but settled for less than Valinor and were comfortable staying at the edge of Middle-earth, where they were not only close to seeing Valinor, but also were a little bit too close in proximity, at least in what would be preferred, to Angband and Ultumo, ut umo. I can't speak black speech. You can forgive me for that. Tolkien didn't even like the language. And lastly, the fair elves, the deep elves. But what were the third group? And I'm not saying that the Neldiar were the ones who all fell. I'm just making the point in illustration. It was the elves that bought the propaganda stunt of the Black Rider, who fled from the one who wanted the best for them, who didn't trust Orome at his word, and went into the woods, into the dark, and ended up getting tortured and corrupted when they were so close to receiving a beautiful land, and who were once beautiful creations. So here's the kicker in both scenarios. They had the choice to trust their Creator or to miss out on His blessings. They had two options set before them: life or death, blessing or cursing, elves or orcs. Hopefully, we can learn something not only from the history that presents it, and as well the Silmarillion's fictional story that has a surprising number of things in common with the historical events, to be able to learn something from all of this. To quote Jonah chapter 2 and verse 8, "Those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy." Let's not make the same mistake. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. I hope it's been a blessing to you. If you have any questions or would like to know more about the topics we have discussed, or perhaps are noticing some things in the awakening of the firstborn that perhaps you'd like to discuss in the comments, I'd be more than happy to match your sincerity for clarity. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go, but most importantly, you know someone who's perhaps familiar with Tolkien's work, but not these biblical themes, or perhaps would just be blessed by this message, please share this study. Join the ministry in helping the gospel go out to our fan base as it would remain. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. And once again, remember that Jesus loves you.